When I was in college, I was a working musician. That's how I helped put myself through college.
What did you play?
I played guitar and sang backup vocals in several bands.
Do you still play?
Yeah, I gave that up a few years ago, mainly because, well, I sold my equipment to buy a wedding ring years ago.
Wow.
And sort of quit the life, as I call it. You know, it's funny because when I was very young, I wanted to be a writer. But I sort of talked myself out of it for a while, so I wound up with a bachelor's in psychology with some writing courses. I took writing courses as a second minor. And I self-published a book on financial planning in 1989 that was well received, got a lot of good reviews for what it was. And so I guess, you know, that era, 1989-ish, was when I really started writing and making a little money at it. And I would tell anybody that has fantasies of being a wealthy writer, that's not the case for 99.9% of the people who write for a living. But most of the time, I've never gone any further than Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I've lived on the prairie all my life. And I'm descended from a family that came to Texas in 1817 when it was still part of Spain. And I'm also a direct descendant of the Ringo family, which John Ringo is a famous gunman.
Don't they call him Johnny Ringo?
Johnny Ringo, yeah. He's my cousin. I was always sort of embarrassed by my cowboy relatives because they were cowboys on both sides of the family. They wore cowboy hats and they talked like cowboys. They would even squat down like cowboys did. And I was always embarrassed by that when I was a kid. And I had no idea of my heritage until I was out of college, and I still really didn't pay much attention to it until my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And then I realized that her generation was the last generation that could possibly remember what their grandparents said. And they were all dying off. And so then I got interested in my family history. And that's literally what led me to write this book about Curly Bill Brocius. This guy that I wrote about is Arizona's most famous outlaw from the 1880s, and he was a Texan. He came from this part of the country, but nobody here in Texas knows anything about him. This book is the result of 8 years of my life, of almost constant work during that 8 years, entirely factual, which is what made it so difficult to research, is the kind of information you have to track down to trace someone who was a criminal and who hid his identity and became, basically he went straight and became a law enforcement official in North Texas. You can imagine he wanted to cover his tracks, and he did so very well. So in 1859, when he was still an infant, he was brought to, Honey Grove, Texas, which is in Fannin County, just next door to it. Honey Grove is probably a 30-minute drive from where we are right. In 1877, there was a gigantic horse drive. I don't know how else to explain it. There was this one individual that lived here in McKinney for a time. His name was J.B. Collins. And he assembled a herd of 10,000 wild horses that he paid men like Curly Bill to go out and round up. And I literally found one of Curly Bill's aliases in one of the McKinney newspapers. He used the alias of Curly Brown, mainly because his father had been put in jail in McKinney at the end of the Civil War because he was already wanted for several crimes that he had committed.
Like what?
Well, he had stolen some bales of cotton down near Waco. You might think, why would anybody steal a bale of cotton? Well, what the merchants in Waco would do is when they had to pay for their goods in Houston, which was the big port city where they got their merchandise, what they would do is they would take their gold that they were going to pay the merchants in Houston with, and they would put it inside a bale of cotton, and then put that bale of cotton with a special marking like a funny different colored cowhide wrapped around it.
So they could identify it.
So the merchants in Houston knew which bale of cotton had their money. And the way they figured it out was there was a criminal organization in this part of Texas that was opening people's mail and reading what was in the mail, and they were stealing money out of the mail. But they also would know through the mail that this shipload of cotton would have gold in it bound for Houston. Let's see, by the time he was a cotton thief, he was 15.
15.
Yeah, he was 15 by that time. This was back in the early days in Texas. There was no law against stealing cattle as long as they were unmarked. They call it mavericking. So if you found stray cattle out on the prairie around McKinney, you could just take that cow and put your brand on it. All you had to do was register the brand and it was yours. But the problem was other people might find that cow and add their brand to your brand and then go register the combined brand, and then it was theirs. So there was really no legal way of resolving these disputes. So what the cattlemen would do is they'd have hired killers go settle accounts for them. Somebody stole their cattle, they'd have them killed. They had literally small armies of these gunmen that would go around and kill people for the cattle.
And that's what he was.
That's what he was. That's how he got started. I have a lot of opposition to this book on Curly-Bill Brocius. Even now I'm attacked on the internet by people who have a vested interest in the Wyatt Earp myth that he killed Curly-Bill Brocius in Arizona, which my book proves is just not true. So I'm constantly under attack by these people because it makes Wyatt Earp look bad. There are even people who have published reviews of the book that are false. They're literally false in what they say is in the book. There's an organized effort out there to discourage people from buying this book.
And you don't feel like you're being a little paranoid?
No, my publisher told me this.
If you think you have a story to tell, send me an email. But I have to tell you up front, it better be good.